Now we are here with Mr. Jerry Harrison. I think everybody knows who Jerry is who's watching this show, but of course from Talking Heads, and Turkuaz was honored to be selected to join Jerry to do some Talking Heads music that unfortunately we did not get to do. Welcome, Jerry.
Well, it's nice to be with you, Dave, and hopefully next year or whatever we can do it, we'll be able to go back to that project.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the plan for all of us. We get inquiries quite regularly, and yes, we are fully planning to resume as planned whenever possible. And today we're talking about healthcare, not specific to the pandemic necessarily, but obviously that is part of what unfortunately has taken musicians off the road is perhaps some sort of lack of infrastructure for healthcare in the whole country. And I think you are quite familiar with the history of this, Jerry, as well as I know you're in various businesses that are involved in the healthcare world. So,
right. Yeah. Well, I do. You and I were having a conversation earlier today, and as I understand it, the reason the United States is sort of unique in its company approach to healthcare rather than a nationwide approach comes from the politics following World War II, where we were the only industrialized country whose infrastructure hadn't been severely damaged by World War II. And particularly in Europe, but I think this is probably true in Japan, the sense was that there needed to be some kind of nationwide system because what it had provided security in the past system, those companies no longer existed, or they were so damaged, and it was going to take years before they could be back. And as well as the fact that there was this sort of war of ideas between communism and, we'll say, the Western moderate state, as Stanley Hoffman would call it. And not always so moderate, as we know. But, and prior to World War I, one of the main reasons that fascism was sometimes embraced was the fear of communism. But the communists were pretty prevalent in France and Italy in particular. And so you had the communists on the one side, and then you had rightist parties that were trying very hard not to seem like the parties that had preceded them, that were the fascist parties. And usually the Christian Democrats were coming down the middle. And healthcare was something that they could kind of all agree on, is that, well, the state should take this on. The United States, I think, looked into this, and then the auto industry was so powerful, which had, of course, had converted and powered the war effort. And I mean, you look at the factories in Detroit, the speed with which tanks rolled off the assembly line, and out west, and airplanes.
Yeah, they ceased production on vehicles, right? And they started
they switched over. And I mean, one of the things that the Japanese couldn't believe was we had this great advantage that we had this electric power, like at the Grand Coulee Dam, so that we could make aluminum. And that allowed us to produce planes. The Japanese planes were part wood and aluminum. And
wow.
they just, when they were shot down, the pipeline was slow, whereas the United States seemed to have an inexhaustible, not very often, not as well designed as the planes by the Luftwaffe and the Japanese until later in the war, when we kind of overtook them. But we overwhelmed them with numbers. But so anyway, this same manufacturing base, and I think there were actually meetings by the head of the United Auto Workers and GM and Ford and Chrysler saying, why don't we take over healthcare? And we can do, as companies, we're able to provide better healthcare. And they saw it as a way that they could then get the best workers for their industries. And the workers who were in those industries, who, those union memberships were of the sort of organized part of labor, were a large portion. They thought we're going to get better healthcare than we would under a national system. And so we got down this route of company-based, and you might say union negotiated company. But of course, we've seen the union population in the United States shrink dramatically, particularly starting around the time of Reagan, where he broke the air traffic control union by saying, by bringing in military air traffic control. And so the anti-union movement and the right to work states and all of these things has, created that whatever power there was to that was resided in the union has gotten smaller and smaller. But it's also created this problem is that a lot of union members have given up wage increases in the United States to have decent health care guaranteed by the companies they work for. Right. So they don't want that undone by national health care. And so it creates this sort of, and we talk about Obamacare and the successes of it, but, to me, it's kind of a pig in the poke.
Yeah, it's a flawed,
it's a very
compromised plan.
And interestingly, like Richard Nixon offered a national health care plan that was so much better than Obamacare and much more complete. Mm-hmm. But of course, the Democrats thought they could get a better one and didn't take it.
Isn't that the story? And here we are again.
Yeah. And so this goes on and on. I do think that the pandemic has certainly lessened the argument that that for the majority of Americans all is well, because so many people, when they were laid off their jobs, suddenly their health care was compromised
in the midst of a healthcare
crisis. In the midst of a healthcare crisis, and so the argument for a more nationalized system became far stronger. Yeah. And I've always thought that there's a really great, you might say, libertarian argument for national health care. And it would go like this, is that in comparison to other countries, one of the strengths and, you might say, weaknesses and brutality of the American system is the idea of the acceptance of failure of companies and bankruptcy. And so companies, we have far more companies are started in this country because there is this sort of climate that says, you have an idea, try it. And if it fails, well, it failed. And there may be 4 people trying to do it and 1 succeeds. Well, that's the way our system works. And so the portability of your healthcare system and, frankly, your pension plan would add to that dynamic, because you now have people not leaving jobs because they don't know what kind of healthcare they would get if they went someplace else, and sort of unhappily staying at a job or not challenging themselves to look for something more challenging or better. And you have companies that are also stagnant. You have companies that are only, trying to hire 3 part-time workers instead of a full-time worker because the benefits packages, they can avoid them. And I think that that's a skew. I think that, it's a little bit like skewed markets are bad markets. And so there would be something far purer, is that anytime someone is hired, a certain, sort of like Social Security, there would be an amount that goes towards maybe health and welfare, and that's what companies do. And it's not run by a private group, and it's run there. And I also think that, we also see, I was just talking to, I've come here to Chicago where I've met a lot of doctors at Northwestern, and they were saying is that a lot of the best hospitals is that the people on Obamacare can't get into them. They just don't take them. The doctors don't take them in their practices, and they get second-rate service anyway. And having been in Italy and my wife flown by helicopter to the city hospital of Naples, I mean, I fortunately got her to the NATO hospital, but it was, there were two healthcare systems there. There was the public one, and then there was the private one.
Right.
And so, if we end up having a universal healthcare, we will have a private one on top of that. And already, the HMOs and Medicare, the amount of time doctors can spend with a patient, especially in the, is so, they have to see 45 patients a day, and they have to only do 15 minutes with each patient. And so it makes the care worse. And I know a lot of doctors that just go, you just got to pay me cash. I just can't stand that anymore. I don't care what kind of insurance you have. You can have that for when you get hit by a car, but like for now. And so we have a sort of broken system. And I don't think any of these things is going to fix it 100%. But there's an awful lot of things that a coordinated system, and I think that if you look at the studies that were done at the time of, even going back to when Hillary Clinton was trying to put this together, of the differences between the Canadian, the English, the Swiss, the French, and the German systems. The Swiss and the German systems and the Dutch are far more public-private partnerships, where some of the others are far more just a public system, with then usually a private one. Like if you want to get a hip transplant, or
you want to opt into a higher quality.
You get it quicker. You get it more quickly.
England is pretty much entirely government run, though. Is that correct?
It's government run, but people often, I think, have an overlay if they have the wealth to be on top of that to speed a process.
Right.
And I think there are doctors that only work privately there too.
Right.
And they also say that, if everything was Medicare for all, Medicare is subsidized by private insurance in the United States, because the hospitals and the doctors would not survive only on Medicare. I mean, one of the things that's happened during the pandemic is all those hospitals that have had to stop doing elective surgeries are going out of business. We're going to have a lot of hospital systems shutting down all across the country just when we need them.
That's where their margins were coming from, right?
Because that's where they were able to make up what they lost on, you might say, public care. And now if it's all public care, they're going bust. And, right.
If there's not a system in place to compensate them properly for it. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's there, we unfortunately, and, I know that there was a friend of mine had gone to I paid a lot of money as a donator to Barack Obama, and he went to a dinner where Barack Obama said, like, if I was starting from scratch, I would definitely do a public system, but I don't want to have suddenly to say, well, these 500,000 people are going to be out of a job next week because we've transitioned to this other system.
And exactly, we started at we're kind of working from where we started. We don't have the ability to start from scratch, which is frustrating, because that's what like you said, so many countries kind of did after World War II, and we just didn't go that route.
Well, it's almost the same thing as happens in computers. It's like one of the things that why was the PC more hackable than the Mac? Because they had to support all of these computers that went way back in time. And so they had these kind of fixes that created holes in the operating system and made them more porous.
Right.
And, again, it's this attempt to sort of patch something that doesn't work particularly well. And sometimes, and of course that's that's always when a older industry or an older company gets displaced by a younger, more agile one. It's usually because the younger one could start with a new paradigm that maybe is much more efficient or takes much less work.
Right.
Runs on a new computer that's much faster. So therefore, it's just in the end becomes much more efficient.
Yep.
I do think, though, that there's lots of things that are simple that could be done. Like there should be a universal for, people's records. There should be a universal way that they are private, but also kept in a way so that you don't have to, every time you get to a doctor, you're filling out this paperwork that just should be already there.
Yeah, I think about
that. That should have been the first thing. It's like, let's come up with a universal standard between the healthcare systems and Medicare and say, that's it. This is what it is. Everyone uses the same thing.
Well, You certainly have a wealth of knowledge on the subject. Maybe we'll check in again. We got to do another one of these, and we'll check in again as things unfold over the coming months. And
I look forward to it. Okay.
Thank you.
For all your listeners, keep on listening to Dave. He'll be easy. Okay.
Thanks for vouching for me. I appreciate it.
All right. Okay. Bye-bye.
Talk to you soon, man. Later.
Okay.